The Americans are coming with their tin cans. That's what German Panzer crews called the M4 Sherman tank in 1944. Tin cans, cigarette lighters, Tommy cookers. They had a dozen derisive nicknames for the American tank that was landing by the thousands on European beaches. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced down waves of T-34S and KV-1S in the frozen steppes of Russia, the Sherman looked like a joke. It was too tall, too lightly armored, its gun was too weak. German intelligence reports called it inferior in every way. To the Panther and Tiger tanks, Panzer aces who had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks looked at grainy reconnaissance photos of Shermans and laughed. This was what the vaunted American industrial machine had produced. This was supposed to stop the Wehrmacht. One German tank commander, looking at technical specifications passed down from headquarters, reportedly told his crew, "If this is what the Americans are bringing, the war will be over by Christmas." Our Christmas. His crew laughed. They were veterans of Kursk, of the great tank battles on the Eastern Front. They'd survived the grinding warfare against Soviet armor. American tanks couldn't possibly be a serious threat. But here's the thing about the Sherman tank. It wasn't designed to win duels with Tigers. It was designed to win a war. And by the time German tank commanders realized the difference between those two goals, it was far too late. This is the story of history's most underestimated tank, the weapon that German crews dismissed, Soviet tankers grudgingly respected, and American crews both loved and hated. This is the story of how 50,000 inferior tanks helped win World War II, not through technical superiority, but through something far more devastating: being good enough in overwhelming numbers, backed by a military-industrial system the Germans couldn't hope to match. Today we're diving deep into the M4 Sherman, the myths surrounding it, the brutal reality of armored combat in World War II, and why German overconfidence proved fatal. Let's get into it. To understand why German tank crews underestimated the Sherman so completely, we need to understand what they were comparing it to and what their experience had taught them about armored warfare. By 1944, the German Panzer forces were arguably the most experienced armored troops in the world. They'd spent nearly 3 years fighting on the Eastern Front against the Red Army. They'd fought in the deserts of North Africa. They'd conducted operations in Italy. These weren't green recruits. These were hardened professionals who had survived some of the most brutal combat in human history. And they'd faced the Soviet T-34, a tank that had genuinely shocked the Wehrmacht when it first appeared in the summer of 1941. The T-34 was a revelation. It had sloped armor that made it effectively much thicker than its nominal specifications suggested. It mounted a powerful 76.2 mm gun that could destroy German tanks at combat ranges. It had wide tracks that gave it excellent mobility in snow and mud. And most terrifyingly from the German perspective, it was being produced in absolutely massive numbers. The appearance of the T-34 had triggered a crisis in German tank development. Suddenly, their Panzer III and IV tanks looked obsolete. German tankers were facing an enemy vehicle that could kill them easily while shrugging off their shots. This led directly to the development of the Panther and Tiger tanks. The Panther, designated as a medium tank despite weighing 45 tons, was in many ways a German answer to the T-34. It had beautifully sloped armor, a long-barreled 75 mm gun that could penetrate virtually any Allied armor at combat ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, and was surprisingly fast and mobile for its weight. The frontal armor was 80 mm thick, but sloped at such an angle that it was effectively much thicker. Most Allied anti-tank weapons simply bounced off. The Tiger I was something else entirely. This was a heavy breakthrough tank designed to smash through enemy defenses. It weighed 56 tons and mounted the famous 88 mm gun derived from the equally famous 88 mm anti-aircraft gun. The Tiger's armor was up to 100 mm thick on the front, and unlike the Panther, it wasn't sloped. It didn't need to be. The armor was just that thick. The 88 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where Allied guns couldn't even reach the Tiger. These weren't just impressive on paper. In combat, they were devastating. A well-positioned Tiger could hold up an entire Allied advance. There are numerous accounts of single Tigers destroying dozens of Allied tanks. The most famous might be Michael Whitman's action at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, where he and his crew destroyed multiple British tanks and armoured vehicles in a matter of minutes, effectively halting a British advance. Panthers were being fielded in larger numbers and were becoming the standard German medium tank. They could engage Shermans at ranges where the Sherman couldn't effectively return fire. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at over a kilometre. The Sherman's 75 gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armour even at close range. So when German tankers first received intelligence briefings on the M4 Sherman, their dismissive attitude wasn't just arrogance. It was based on a clear-eyed assessment of the technical specifications. The Sherman's frontal hull armour topped out at 76 thinner than a Panther's effective armour thickness. The glacis plate was sloped, which helped, but it still wasn't enough. The Sherman's standard 75 M3 gun was the same gun used on earlier American tanks. It was adequate against Panzer IVs, the older German medium tank, but it struggled against the newer German armour. Against a Panther's frontal armour, it was almost useless beyond point-blank range. Against a Tiger, it had virtually no chance. The Sherman stood 9 feet tall, making it a significantly larger target than the lower-profile German tanks. It used a gasoline engine, specifically a Continental radial engine, which could catch fire when the tank was penetrated. Early Sherman models had their main gun ammunition stored in sponsons above the tracks, which proved catastrophically vulnerable. When a penetrating hit struck these ammunition racks, the results were often fatal for the entire crew. German intelligence assessments were damning. One report circulated among Panzer units stated bluntly that the Sherman was a tank from 1941 trying to fight a 1944 war. Another described it as having the armor of a light tank, the gun of a pre-war design, and the profile of a barn. The nicknames reflected this contempt. Ronson was particularly popular, referring to the Ronson cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." The implication was that Shermans burst into flames as reliably as a quality lighter. Tommy Cooker and Zippo carried the same dark humor. German tankers also called them Blechdosen, tin cans. Veteran tank commanders shared stories that reinforced this contempt. Otto Carius, a Tiger commander who would end the war, credited with over 150 tank kills, wrote in his memoirs that encountering Shermans was essentially target practice. Another tank ace, Kurt Knispel, the highest-scoring tank ace of all time, with 168 confirmed kills, reportedly said that shooting a Sherman was like hitting a tin can with a hammer. This wasn't empty boasting. In head-to-head engagements, the statistics bore out German confidence. A Panther could reasonably expect to destroy 3 to 5 Shermans before being knocked out itself. A Tiger's ratio was even more lopsided. German after-action reports from Normandy in June and July 1944 are filled with accounts of dramatically uneven exchanges. One Panther commander reported destroying 9 Shermans in a single afternoon engagement near Caen, without his tank suffering any significant damage. Another account from July 1944 describes a single Tiger tank positioned on a ridge, holding up an entire American armored column, destroying 13 Shermans over several hours before finally being forced to withdraw when it ran low on ammunition, not because it was in danger of being destroyed. The Germans had good reason for their confidence. They had built superior tanks. The engineering was excellent, the weapons were powerful, the armor was thick. On paper, and in many real engagements, German tanks dominated. But wars aren't fought on paper. And the Germans were about to receive a brutal education in what actually wins armored warfare. The fundamental mistake German tank crews and commanders made was assuming that tank versus tank combat was what mattered most in armored warfare. It's an understandable error. When you're sitting in a tank, enemy tanks seem like the biggest threat. They're the thing that can kill you most directly. So naturally, German thinking focused on building tanks that could win tank duels. But here's the reality. Tank-on-tank fighting was actually a relatively small part of what tanks did in World War II. Most of a tank's time was spent supporting infantry, engaging fortifications, destroying supply vehicles, suppressing anti-tank positions, and serving as mobile, protected fire support. Pure tank versus tank battles, though they certainly happened, were not the norm. The Americans understood this. The Sherman wasn't designed primarily to hunt Tigers and Panthers. That was supposed to be the job of specialized tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine, M18 Hellcat, or M36 Jackson. The Sherman's primary role was combined arms warfare, working alongside infantry, artillery, and air power to overwhelm enemy defenses. And for that role, the Sherman was actually brilliantly designed. Let me explain why. First, and this cannot be overstated, reliability. The Sherman was dramatically more reliable than German tanks, and this mattered far more than most people realize. The Sherman's Continental R-975 radial engine was derived from aircraft engines that American industry had been mass-producing for years. It was well understood, reliable, relatively easy to maintain, and simple to repair. The transmission was sturdy and could handle the tank's weight without constant breakdowns. The suspension system, using vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, on early models and horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, on later models, was simple, durable, and easy to maintain. Contrast this with German tanks. The Panther's Marbach HL-230 engine was powerful but temperamental. The transmission was notoriously fragile, especially in early production models. Panthers would break down after relatively short distances. The complex interleaved road wheel system that both Panthers and Tigers used looked impressive, but was a maintenance nightmare. In winter, mud would pack between the wheels and freeze overnight, immobilizing the tank. Replacing a damaged inner road wheel required removing all the outer wheels first, a task that could take an entire day. Tigers required constant, meticulous maintenance. The engine had to be carefully managed. The transmission could fail catastrophically if mistreated. These weren't tanks you could just drive into battle. They were high-maintenance weapons that demanded skilled crews and well-supplied maintenance units. What did this mean in practice? A Sherman could drive hundreds of miles without significant mechanical issues. American armored divisions could maintain operational tempo, moving quickly and striking where the enemy was weak. German Panzer divisions, in contrast, were constantly dealing with mechanical breakdowns. Panthers would begin a battle with, say, 70 operational tanks, and by the end of the day, half might be knocked out or broken down, with no way to tell from a distance which was which. Strategic mobility, the ability to get your forces where they need to be, when they need to be there, matters far more than tactical superiority in individual engagements. The Germans were learning this the hard way. Second, ergonomics and crew efficiency. The Sherman was designed with the crew in mind in ways that German tanks often weren't. The Sherman had a 5-man crew with clearly defined roles: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver bow gunner. The interior, while cramped by modern standards, was relatively spacious compared to other tanks. Critically, it had a turret basket, a floor that rotated with the turret. This meant the turret crew wasn't stumbling over equipment and fighting for footing every time the turret traversed. It sounds like a small thing, but in combat, it made an enormous difference in crew efficiency. Visibility was excellent. The commander had a rotating cupola with vision blocks all around, giving him a 360-degree view. The driver had good forward visibility. The tank had multiple periscopes. Being able to see the battlefield and maintain situational awareness is absolutely critical in armored warfare, and the Sherman excelled at this. Communications were another major advantage. Every Sherman had a radio, every single one. The crew could communicate with each other via intercom, and the tank could communicate with other tanks, with infantry, and with supporting units. This seems obvious now, but it wasn't universal in World War II. Many German tanks, especially earlier in the war, had radios only in command vehicles. Platoon and company commanders could communicate, but individual tanks couldn't. This made coordinated action much more difficult. The Panther and Tiger, despite being larger tanks, had surprisingly cramped interiors. The Panther's 75 mm gun had such a large breech that it dominated the turret space. The loader had to work around this massive piece of equipment. The crew was constantly in each other's way. The Tiger was better in this regard, but still not as well laid out as the Sherman. In combat, these ergonomic factors translated directly into combat effectiveness. A Sherman crew could spot threats faster, communicate more effectively, and maintain better situational awareness than German crews. They could sustain a higher rate of fire because the loader had room to work. These advantages are hard to quantify in statistics, but they were very real. Third, the gun, and why the 75 mm was actually a smart choice despite its limitations against heavy armor. Yes, the 75 mm M3 gun, mounted in standard Shermans, couldn't penetrate heavy German armor frontally. This is the criticism everyone focuses on. But consider what the gun could do. It was perfectly adequate against Panzer IVs, which made up the majority of German armor through 1944. It could penetrate their armor at normal combat ranges. The Panzer IV was Germany's most common tank, and the Sherman could handle it. The 75 mm had excellent high-explosive rounds. When you're not fighting tanks, which remember was most of the time, you're engaging bunkers, buildings, field fortifications, anti-tank guns, trucks and infantry. The 75 mm was outstanding for this. It could fire devastating high-explosive rounds, white phosphorus for smoke or anti-personnel effects, and even canister rounds for close-range anti-infantry work. The gun was reliable and accurate. The gyro stabilizer, while not perfect, meant you could fire while moving with reasonable accuracy, something German tanks couldn't do at all. In a fluid engagement, being able to shoot on the move was a massive advantage. And critically, when American commanders realized the 75 mm was inadequate against newer German armor, they responded quickly. By late 1944, Shermans with 76 mm guns were arriving in Europe. These had significantly better armor penetration. The British mounted the powerful 17-pounder gun in some Shermans, creating the Firefly, which could penetrate any German tank. The Sherman's design was modular enough to accept these upgrades without major redesign. Can you imagine the Germans doing something similar with a Panther or Tiger? The design was so tight, so specific, that major modifications were nearly impossible without essentially creating a new tank. The Sherman's design philosophy allowed for evolution and adaptation. Fourth, and this is absolutely critical, production, logistics, and the industrial war. The Sherman was designed from the start to be mass-produced. It used components and manufacturing techniques that American industry was already good at. The hull was cast and welded, using processes that tank factories but also railroad equipment manufacturers could handle. The engine was based on proven designs, parts were standardized. The result? America produced 49,234 Shermans during the war. Britain produced thousands more using Sherman components. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. Total. Think about that ratio. But it's not just about raw numbers, it's about logistics and sustainability. The Sherman was designed to fit within certain weight and size limits. It could fit in standard landing craft. It could cross most bridges without special preparation. It could be transported by standard rail cars. This meant Shermans could be moved quickly to wherever they were needed. Spare parts were standardized and produced in enormous quantities. When a Sherman broke down, parts were readily available. When a Sherman was knocked out, the crew could often be given a new tank within days. American armored divisions could sustain themselves in combat far longer than German units. For German tank units, logistics were a nightmare. Each Tiger required special rail cars because of its weight. Spare parts were chronically short. When Panthers or Tigers were destroyed, they often couldn't be replaced. German Panzer divisions in 1944 were supposed to have over 200 tanks. In reality, they often fielded 50 or fewer, and those numbers just kept declining. The Americans could afford to lose tanks because more were always coming. The Germans couldn't afford to lose any because replacements weren't coming. This fundamentally changed the calculus of armored warfare. The M4. Sherman first saw significant combat in British service at the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa in October 1942. The Germans there were fielding Panzer IIIs and the earlier Panzer IV models, and the Sherman proved superior to both. Its 75 mm gun could penetrate German armor at combat ranges. Its armor was thick enough to resist most German anti-tank weapons of the period, and its reliability was a godsend compared to the troubled British tanks. British tank crews who had been fighting in Crusaders, Valentines, and the troubled Cromwell were genuinely thrilled with the Sherman. It was reliable, it had good visibility, it had a radio, and it could actually compete with German armor. The Sherman quickly became the standard tank for British armored divisions, and it would remain so for the rest of the war. But North Africa wasn't where the Sherman's reputation would truly be made or broken. That would happen in Northwest Europe after D-Day, when American Shermans met German Panthers and Tigers in large numbers for the first time. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Shermans rolled off landing craft, many of them modified with flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement, getting thousands of tanks across the English Channel and onto hostile beaches. German intelligence had known the invasion was coming, but seeing the sheer scale of Allied armor pouring into France must have been sobering. The bocage country of Normandy was perhaps the worst possible terrain for the Sherman. Bocage is a landscape of small fields separated by thick hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, sometimes with trees growing out of them. These hedgerows were centuries old, built up over generations, and they turned Normandy into a maze of natural fortifications. The Germans used this terrain brilliantly. They positioned anti-tank guns and tanks at the ends of lanes, waiting for Allied armor to advance. A Sherman column would roll down a narrow lane between high hedgerows, and suddenly the lead tank would be hit by a Panther or an 88 mm anti-tank gun positioned hundreds of meters away. The lead Sherman would be destroyed, blocking the lane. The following Shermans couldn't advance and couldn't retreat. They were sitting ducks. German after-action reports from June and early July 1944 radiated confidence. One Panther battalion commander reported destroying 27 Allied tanks in 3 days without losing a single Panther to enemy fire. 2 were lost to mechanical breakdowns, but none to combat. A Tiger company near Caen reported destroying 47 Allied tanks, a mix of Shermans and British Cromwells, over a week while losing just 3 Tigers. For American tank crews, it was a brutal introduction to combat. Units were taking horrifying casualties. The 2nd Armored Division reported tank losses exceeding 50% in some battalions during the first weeks after D-Day. The 3rd Armored Division had similar experiences. Crews were calling their Shermans death traps and Purple Heart boxes. Stories spread among American tankers about the invulnerability of German armor. There were accounts, some exaggerated, some not, of Shermans hitting Panthers and Tigers multiple times without effect, while a single German round would destroy a Sherman. One Sherman crew reported firing 7 rounds at a Panther at close range. All 7 bounced off, and the Panther's return fire destroyed them. The term Ronson became dark humor among the crews. When a Sherman was hit, there was a very real chance it would burst into flames, often so quickly that the crew couldn't escape. The ammunition storage in the sponsons was particularly vulnerable. A penetrating hit there would ignite the stored rounds, and the resulting fire was usually unsurvivable. German confidence seemed entirely justified. In late June 1944, a single Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann became legendary after destroying much of a British armoured column at Villers-Bocage. Wittmann's Tiger destroyed approximately 14 tanks and 15 other armoured vehicles in 15 minutes. 1 tank, 15 minutes. Allied advance halted. For several weeks, it looked like German tanks had every advantage. The Allies had air superiority, they had more tanks, they had more of everything. And yet they were being chewed up in the hedgerows by German armor that seemed almost untouchable. But then things started to change. First, American ingenuity found solutions to the blockage problem. Sergeant Curtis Culin, a tanker with the 2nd Armored Division, developed a simple device: steel teeth welded to the front of a Sherman that could cut through hedgerows. These Cullen hedgerow cutters, or rhino teeth, allowed Shermans to burst through hedgerows instead of being channeled into killing zones. Thousands were manufactured using steel from German beach obstacles and welded onto Sherman front hulls. Suddenly, Shermans weren't predictable. They could appear anywhere. German anti-tank guns, carefully positioned to cover specific lanes, found themselves bypassed. The tactical advantage of the blockage was significantly reduced. Second, American doctrine evolved rapidly. Tank officers learned not to send Shermans charging down lanes. They learned to use infantry scouts to identify German positions. They learned to call in artillery to suppress suspected enemy locations before advancing armor. They learned to work in coordinated teams where some Shermans would suppress a target with fire while others maneuvered to get flank shots. The U.S. Army's flexibility and willingness to adapt based on combat experience became a major advantage. When it became clear the 75mm gun was inadequate against Panthers and Tigers, the response was immediate. Shermans mounting the 76mm M1 gun started arriving in France in late July 1944. The 76mm had significantly better armor penetration and could deal with German heavy armor at reasonable ranges. When crews complained about ammunition fires, engineers developed wet storage, ammunition racks jacketed with water and glycerine that would suppress fires if the tank was penetrated. This modification dramatically reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. Shermans with wet storage were much more survivable, and the modification was retrofitted to tanks already in the field. The Germans couldn't adapt like this. Their industry was under relentless bombing. Their logistics were breaking down. They were fighting on multiple fronts. When a Panther broke down, parts might take weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. There was no capacity to rapidly iterate on designs or push modifications to field units. Third, and this was perhaps the most important change, American combined arms doctrine matured into something devastatingly effective. American commanders learned that Shermans shouldn't fight alone. Artillery would be called in to suppress suspected German positions. Fighter bombers would be on call to strike any German armor spotted. Infantry would advance with the tanks, protecting them from Panzerfaust teams and scouting ahead for anti-tank tank positions. Tank destroyers with more powerful guns would be positioned to handle heavy German armor, while Shermans dealt with everything else. This wasn't how the Germans fought anymore. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was desperately short of infantry, artillery, ammunition, and fuel. They couldn't coordinate complex combined arms operations the way they had earlier in the war. Their panzer divisions were often fighting with minimal infantry support, inadequate artillery, and no air cover whatsoever. And speaking of air cover, the Allies owned the sky. This cannot be overstated. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was barely functional in Western Europe. Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons and Tempests, roamed the battlefield with near impunity. These aircraft hunted German armor relentlessly. A Panther might be nearly invulnerable to Shermans frontally, but it was a sitting duck for a P-47 carrying rockets or a Typhoon with armor-piercing cannons. The thinner top armor of German tanks made them vulnerable to attacks from above. German tankers learned that moving during daylight was suicide. They had to hide in forests, in buildings, in any cover they could find. Movement was restricted to night or very bad weather. This gave the Allies an enormous operational tempo advantage. American armored columns could advance 20 or 30 miles in a day. German units were lucky to move 5 miles without being attacked from the air. One German tank commander later recalled, "We had better tanks, better guns, better armor, but we couldn't move. The Jabos, fighter bombers, were everywhere. The Americans could move wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. We could only sit and wait. How do you fight a war like that? By August 1944, the strategic situation in Normandy had fundamentally shifted. The Allies broke out from the bocage at Operation Cobra, and suddenly German forces were in danger of encirclement. The Falaise pocket became a slaughter as Allied air power and armor destroyed retreating German units. German tank crews were still achieving impressive kill ratios in individual engagements, but they were losing battles, losing territory, and most critically, losing irreplaceable tanks and crews faster than they could be replaced. The early confidence was evaporating. German after-action reports from late summer 1944 show a very different tone than those from June. Instead of boasting about Sherman kills, they're filled with concerns about overwhelming Allied numbers, constant air attacks, ammunition and fuel shortages, and the impossibility of conducting mobile operations. The Sherman wasn't looking so funny anymore. Let's address the famous statistic that gets thrown around constantly. It took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther or Tiger. This 5-to-1 ratio has become conventional wisdom, repeated in documentaries, books, and internet discussions. Like most combat statistics from World War II, it's both true in certain contexts and deeply misleading as a general rule. The statistic comes from a few sources. Some German tank commanders in their post-war memoirs claimed they could handle 4 or 5 Shermans before being knocked out. Some analysis of specific engagements showed Sherman losses were roughly 5 times higher than German losses. Belton Cooper's controversial book, Death Traps, suggested similar ratios based on his experience as a maintenance officer seeing knocked-out tanks. But here's what this statistic doesn't tell you: context, circumstances, and what killed actually means. In optimal conditions, a dug-in Panther or Tiger engaging Shermans across open ground at long range with no artillery or air support to worry about. Yes, a German tank could destroy multiple Shermans. The technical advantage was real, but optimal conditions almost never existed in actual combat. What actually happened when American tankers encountered German armor wasn't glorious single combat. It was combined arms warfare at its most brutal. When American tank crews spotted German armor, their first action usually wasn't to charge in for a air-tank duel. They called in artillery. American artillery was extraordinarily effective, and by 1944, the artillery calling systems were well developed. A Sherman commander could radio coordinates, and within minutes, dozens of 105 mm or 155 mm high-explosive shells would be landing on the German position. German tanks weren't immune to artillery. A near miss could damage tracks, optics, or external equipment. A direct hit could disable or destroy even a Tiger. More importantly, artillery fire suppressed the German tank, making it difficult for the crew to effectively fight back. They'd be buttoned up inside the tank, visibility reduced, unable to see threats approaching from multiple directions. Simultaneously, the call would go out for air support. If the weather was decent, fighter bombers could be on station quickly. German tanks learned to fear the distinctive sound of approaching P-47ER or Typhoons. These aircraft carried rockets, bombs, and cannons that could penetrate the thinner top and rear armor of German tanks. While this was happening, American tanks wouldn't sit still. They'd maneuver, using terrain and smoke, to approach from multiple directions. The goal wasn't a fair fight. The goal was to get side or rear shots where even the 75 mm gun could penetrate German armor. Infantry would be working forward too, armed with bazookas and sticky bombs, looking for opportunities to engage at close range. Tank destroyer units, if available, would be moving into position with their more powerful guns specifically designed for anti-tank work. The Germans called this gangster tactics, using overwhelming force and every possible advantage instead of fighting fairly. But war isn't fair. The American approach was to ensure that German tanks never got to fight in their optimal conditions. Let me give you a specific, well-documented example: the Battle of Araucourt in September 1944. A German Panzer brigade, the 113th Panzer Brigade, was committed to counterattack the American forces that had crossed into Lorraine. The German force had approximately 100 tanks, mostly Panthers and Panzer IVs, plus some supporting infantry. The Americans had elements of the 4th Armored Division with roughly 40 Shermans in the immediate area, plus tank destroyer units and, crucially, excellent artillery support and air superiority. On paper, this should have been a German victory. They had numerical superiority and technically superior tanks. They were conducting an offensive operation, which generally favors the attacker. And they had experienced crews. What actually happened? The battle lasted several days, from September 18th to 29. The Germans lost 86 tanks, including the majority of their Panthers. The 113th Panzer Brigade was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. American losses were 25 Shermans. Now 25 to 86 isn't 5 to 1, it's closer to 1 to 3 in the Americans' favor. How did this happen? The Americans used terrain brilliantly. They fought from hull-down positions on ridge lines, where only their turrets were exposed. They had excellent visibility and could spot German tanks at long ranges. The American tank commanders coordinated effectively by radio. They called in artillery on German assembly areas. Tank destroyers with 76 mm and 90 mm guns engaged Panthers at range, while Shermans maneuvered for flank shots. And critically, the Germans had to attack. They had to move, to advance across ground where American observers could see them. Movement makes you vulnerable. The Americans were in prepared positions. When weather allowed, American aircraft appeared and savaged German columns. German accounts from Aracourt repeatedly mention the devastating effect of Allied air power. And here's the most important part. Within 48 hours, all 25 lost Shermans had been replaced. The 4th Armored Division was back at full strength. The German Panzer Brigade ceased to exist. Those 86 lost tanks were never replaced. This pattern repeated across France, into Germany, and throughout the final year of the war. German units would win tactical engagements, destroying more Allied tanks than they lost. But they'd lose the battle, lose territory, and hemorrhage irreplaceable equipment. By late 1944, the quality of German tank crews was declining precipitously. Early in the war, German panzer crews received extensive training, 6 months or more before seeing combat. By 1944, training had been cut to a few weeks due to fuel shortages and the desperate need for replacements. Some German tankers were going into combat, having driven a Panther or Tiger for only a few hours of total training time. Meanwhile, American tank crews were receiving better training. While American training early in the war was sometimes inadequate, by 1944, crews were getting several months of instruction stateside before deploying. They arrived in Europe with good basic skills, and those who survived initial combat became veterans quickly. The experience gap that had favored Germany early in the war had reversed. A German Panther crew in late 1944 might have a commander who was a veteran, but the rest of the crew might be teenagers with minimal training. An American Sherman crew in late 1944 was likely to have at least some members with combat experience, good training for all members, and most importantly, confidence in their equipment and their support. This brings up another crucial factor that statistics don't capture: morale and psychology. Early in the Normandy campaign, American tankers were often terrified of German tanks. The psychological advantage was entirely with the Germans. But as American crews gained experience, learned tactics that worked, and saw that German tanks could be defeated, confidence grew. Conversely, German morale was cracking. Yes, individual German tankers were still fighting effectively, but they could see the strategic reality. They were being pushed back relentlessly. Their kill ratios didn't matter because more Allied tanks always appeared. They couldn't move during the day because of air attacks. Supply was breaking down. Fuel was critically short. German tankers started to realize something devastating. They were winning individual battles and losing the war. Their technical superiority meant nothing against Allied material superiority. Otto Carius, the tank ace who once called Sherman hunting target practice, later wrote, "We could destroy 10 enemy tanks for every one we lost. And it wouldn't matter. They had 10 more behind those." We had none. The 5-to-1 myth also ignores how most Shermans were actually lost. Contrary to popular belief, most tank losses in World War II weren't from tank versus tank combat. They were from anti-tank guns, mines, mechanical breakdown, artillery, and abandonment when supply lines broke down. The Panther might have an advantage in tank duels, but that wasn't where most combat losses occurred. The final nail in the coffin of the 5-to-1 myth. Even if it were true, the Americans could afford it. With 50,000 Shermans produced, even a 5-to-1 loss ratio would mean America could trade 25,000 Shermans to destroy 5,000 German tanks. Germany only produced about 8,000 Panthers and Tigers combined. The math simply didn't work for Germany, no matter how good their tanks were. German tank crews' fundamental misunderstanding wasn't about the Sherman itself. It was about what they were really fighting. They weren't fighting Shermans. They were fighting the entire American combined arms system, and by 1944, that system was the most effective military machine in the world. Let's break down what supporting a Sherman in combat actually meant. Artillery. This is where we need to spend serious time because American artillery was arguably the real killer on the Western Front. The Americans had perfected artillery to a degree that shocked even their allies. The standard American artillery piece supporting armored operations was the M101 105 mm howitzer. Every American infantry and armored division had multiple artillery battalions. But the weapon itself wasn't what made American artillery dominant. It was the system. Americans had developed the Fire Direction Center, a centralized system for coordinating artillery fire. Multiple batteries could be coordinated to fire on a single target, with shells timed to arrive simultaneously. This time-on-target technique meant that instead of shells arriving in a sequence that gave the enemy warning, suddenly 50 or 100 shells would explode in the same few seconds. The effect on German forces was devastating. A dug-in German tank position would call out Sherman sightings, prepare to engage, and then without warning, the world would explode around them. Even if the tank survived, external equipment would be damaged, tracks could be thrown, optics shattered, crews stunned. Forward observers with Sherman units could call in fire support and have shells landing within 3 to 5 minutes. German artillery, by comparison, was slower, had less ammunition available, and was being steadily destroyed by Allied counter-battery fire and air attacks. The Americans also had proximity-fused shells, a secret weapon that exploded in an airburst above the target, rather than on impact. These were absolutely devastating against infantry and soft-skinned vehicles and could damage exposed equipment on tanks. German forces had no defense against proximity fuses. They didn't even understand how they worked until late in the war. Air support. If artillery was the most lethal element of American combined arms, air support was the most psychologically devastating. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe in Western Europe was finished as an effective fighting force. The Allies had achieved air superiority so complete that German ground forces rarely saw friendly aircraft. Meanwhile, Allied fighter bombers were omnipresent. The P-47 Thunderbolt became particularly feared. These heavy fighters carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, plus rockets or bombs. A flight of 4 P-47s could devastate a German tank column. The .50 caliber rounds couldn't penetrate frontal armor, but could damage tracks, optics, external equipment, and could penetrate the thinner top and rear armor. The British Hawker Typhoon was even more feared. Armed with 20 mm cannons and carrying rockets, Typhoons hunted German armor relentlessly. Rocket-armed Typhoons could knock out any German tank with a direct hit. American doctrine integrated air support into ground operations seamlessly. Forward air controllers moved with ground units and could call in strikes with remarkable speed. If a Sherman unit encountered strong German resistance, fighter bombers could be overhead in 15 to 20 minutes. The psychological impact on German crews cannot be overstated. They couldn't move during daylight without inviting air attack. Parking under trees or in buildings only helped so much. The distinctive sound of approaching fighter bombers, The Jabos, as Germans called them, caused immediate panic. Crews would abandon their tanks and run for cover. Even if the tank survived the attack, time was wasted, the crew was shaken, and operational tempo was lost. Tank destroyers. The American tank destroyer concept is often criticized by historians, but in practice, these vehicles were highly effective. The M18 Hellcat, Me-10 Wolverine, and M36 Jackson were purpose-built tank killers. The M18 Hellcat deserves special mention. It mounted a 76 gun on a lightly armored chassis that could reach 55 miles per hour on roads, faster than most cars of the era. The doctrine was simple: speed and firepower over protection. Hellcats would race around enemy flanks and ambush German tanks from the side or rear. German tank crews learned to fear Hellcats. You'd be engaging Shermans to your front, and suddenly a Hellcat would appear on your flank at point-blank range. The 76 gun could penetrate Panther side armor. One shot, then the Hellcat would speed away before you could respond. The M36 Jackson mounted a 90 gun that could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at reasonable ranges. These started arriving in Europe in late 1944 and fundamentally changed the armor balance. German heavy tanks were no longer invulnerable. The American system was for Shermans to fix German tanks in place, suppressing them, threatening them, keeping them occupied. Tank destroyers would maneuver for killing shots. It was hunter-killer tactics, and it was devastatingly effective. Infantry coordination. American infantry-tank cooperation improved dramatically as the war progressed. Initial infantry-tank coordination in Normandy was poor, with tanks and infantry often operating independently. By late 1944, the cooperation was excellent. Infantry would advance with tanks, protecting them from close-range anti-tank weapons. Soldiers with bazookas could knock out German tanks that Shermans couldn't penetrate. Infantry would scout ahead, identifying German positions so tanks wouldn't blunder into ambushes. The infantry telephone on the back of Shermans allowed infantry to communicate directly with the tank commander without exposing themselves. This simple modification dramatically improved coordination. In urban combat, infantry tank teams became lethal. Infantry would clear buildings while tanks provided fire support. Tanks would blast strongpoints that infantry couldn't overcome. It was true combined arms warfare in the most literal sense. The system versus the machine. This is the core of why German confidence in their superior tanks was misplaced. They were optimizing for tank versus tank combat. The Americans were optimizing for winning battles. A German tank commander might see a Sherman and think, "I can kill that easily." What he should have been thinking was that Sherman has artillery on call, fighter bombers overhead, tank destroyers maneuvering for flank shots, and infantry with bazookas nearby. If I engage that Sherman, what happens next? The answer to that question was almost always, I die, or I retreat, or my tank breaks down before I reach safety. German officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs consistently identified this as the critical factor. Hans von Luck, a Panzer commander who fought from Poland to Normandy, wrote, "The Americans didn't fight tanks with tanks. They fought tanks with everything. We couldn't win that fight." As the war moved into Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, the nature of combat changed dramatically. The sweeping tank battles in open country gave way to brutal urban fighting, and here the Sherman's supposed weaknesses became almost irrelevant, while its practical advantages became paramount. In cities and towns, combat ranges collapsed. You weren't fighting at 1,000 yards across Norman fields or 1,500 yards in Lorraine. You were fighting at 50 to 200 yards in rubble-choked streets. At these ranges, the Panther's superior gun didn't matter. Any gun could penetrate any armor. What mattered was reliability, visibility, maneuverability, and the ability to coordinate with infantry. The Sherman excelled at all of these. Urban combat is brutal on tanks. Rubble damages tracks. Streets can collapse into basements. Panzerfaust teams can approach unseen and strike from windows or basements. A tank in a city is vulnerable from every direction. The Sherman's excellent visibility became critical. The commander's rotating cupola allowed him to scan for threats continuously. Multiple vision blocks meant the crew could maintain situational awareness even when buttoned up. German tanks with more limited visibility were at a severe disadvantage in three-dimensional urban combat. The Sherman's reliable engine and transmission meant it could maneuver through debris, reverse quickly, navigate tight corners, all critical in urban terrain. Panthers with their fragile transmissions and Tigers with their weight and size struggled in cities. The 75 gun, criticized for inadequacy against heavier armor, was actually ideal for urban combat. It could fire high explosive rounds to blast buildings and bunkers. It had a high angle of elevation, allowing it to fire into upper-story windows. The rate of fire was good, important when engaging multiple targets in quick succession. German commanders were increasingly forced to use their Panthers and Tigers in static defensive positions, essentially as bunkers. This was a terrible waste of these tanks' mobility and long-range firepower, but there was no choice. Fuel shortages meant mobile operations were impossible. Air superiority meant movement invited destruction. A Panther positioned in a building as a strongpoint was certainly dangerous, but it was also trapped. American tactics for dealing with these positions became standardized. Suppress with artillery, flank with infantry, and destroy with bazookas, tank destroyers, or close-range shots from Shermans. The Battle of Aachen in October 1944 demonstrated these dynamics. Aachen was the first major German city to be assaulted, and the fighting was ferocious. German forces fought building by building, but American combined arms tactics ground through the defenses methodically. Shermans provided direct fire support for infantry assaults. Artillery leveled buildings suspected of harboring German troops. Infantry cleared structures and protected tanks from Panzerfaust teams. The Germans had Panthers and other armor in Aachen, but they couldn't maneuver effectively. They were destroyed piecemeal. The city fell after 3 weeks of fighting. The Sherman's modularity and adaptability also showed its value in late-war fighting. Specialized variants proliferated. The Sherman Dozer mounted a bulldozer blade for clearing rubble and obstacles. In urban combat, being able to clear a blocked street was tactically valuable. The Crocodile, or Zippo, Sherman mounted flamethrowers. These were horrifying but effective weapons for clearing bunkers and fortified buildings. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman was up-armored to 102 on the front, thicker than a Panther. These were used as assault tanks to lead attacks on heavily defended positions. The T-34 Calliope mounted 60 rocket tubes on top of the turret for saturation bombardment. These provided mobile artillery support. The 105 Sherman mounted a howitzer for direct fire support against fortifications. Could you imagine the Germans rapidly producing and fielding such specialized variants of Panthers or Tigers? The design complexity and production constraints made it impossible. The Sherman's relatively simple, modular design allowed for this kind of adaptation. The Rhine crossings in March 1945 demonstrated American combined arms superiority at its peak. The Germans had blown bridges and prepared elaborate defenses on the east bank. Crossing a major river against prepared defenses is one of the most difficult military operations. American engineers bridged the Rhine in multiple locations under fire. Shermans poured across, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. German defenders, short on fuel, ammunition, and hope, couldn't stop the crossings. Within days, American armored divisions were racing into the German heartland. The final battles of the war saw German tank units that once had hundreds of vehicles reduced to a handful. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had fought since 1939, ended the war with fewer than 20 operational tanks. The Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's elite armored training demonstration unit, was destroyed and reformed multiple times, each iteration weaker than the last. Meanwhile, American armored divisions maintained their strength. Tank losses were replaced. Damaged tanks were repaired. The system kept functioning. Let's return to where we started. German tank crews laughing at intelligence reports about the Sherman. What happened to that confidence? By April 1945, Germany was being crushed from all sides. The Russians were in Berlin. Americans and British were pushing from the west. German forces were disintegrating. The thousand-year Reich had months left. And still the Shermans came, across the Rhine, through the Ruhr industrial region, into Bavaria and Austria. Endless columns of Allied armor, supported by artillery that could level towns, covered by aircraft that ruled the skies. German panzer divisions existed mostly on paper. Units that should have had 200 tanks might have 10 or 15 operational vehicles, and fuel to run them for only a few hours. Replacement parts didn't exist. Experienced crews were dead or captured. The new crews were boys and old men with minimal training. The vaunted Panther and Tiger tanks, the weapons that were supposed to stop the Allied advance, the tanks that German crews had been so confident in. Where were they? Thousands were destroyed in combat. Thousands more were abandoned due to mechanical breakdowns or lack of fuel. You can find photographs from 1945 of perfectly intact Panthers and Tigers just sitting by the roadside, out of fuel, left behind by retreating troops. The mighty tanks reduced to obstacles. The Americans captured hundreds of German tanks intact and tested them extensively. The reports were illuminating. Yes, the guns were powerful. Yes, the armor was thick. But the transmissions were fragile. The engines were temperamental. The complexity made maintenance difficult. The interleaved wheels were a nightmare. For every advantage, there was a corresponding flaw. One American tank officer, testing a captured Panther, reported, "Impressive when it works, but it broke down after 50 miles. We have Shermans that have driven 5,000 miles and are still operational. Which would you rather have in a war?" The psychological journey of German tank crews through the war is striking. In 1943, they were confident, often arrogant. They had reason to be. They had the experience and the equipment. By 1944, confidence was giving way to concern. The Allied material advantage was becoming overwhelming. By 1945, the dominant emotion was resignation. They were still fighting, but they knew they'd lost. Otto Carius, the ace who called Sherman hunting target practice, ended the war in hiding from Soviet forces. His over 150 tank kills, an incredible individual achievement, had meant nothing in the strategic picture. Michael Wittmann, Germany's most famous tank ace, was killed in action in August 1944. Possibly by a Sherman, possibly by Allied aircraft. Accounts vary. Even genius couldn't overcome overwhelming force. The German military's focus on tactical and technical excellence while ignoring strategic realities was a fundamental error. They built the best tanks, trained skilled crews, developed sophisticated tactics, and lost because none of that addressed their strategic problems. They couldn't match Allied production. They couldn't protect their supply lines. They couldn't achieve air superiority. They couldn't replace losses. They couldn't maintain their equipment in the field. They were fighting enemies who could absorb punishing losses and come back stronger while German losses were permanent. The Sherman's inferiority was actually a kind of superiority. It was inferior in direct combat against heavy tanks, yes, but it was superior in every metric that actually mattered for winning a war: reliability, maintainability, deployability, availability, flexibility, and suitability for combined arms warfare. By war's end, over 50,000 Shermans had been produced. They served on every front. They equipped the armies of the United States, Britain, Canada, Free France, Poland, and numerous other Allied nations. Through Lend-Lease, thousands went to the Soviet Union. After the war, Shermans continued serving for decades. They fought in the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli Wars, the Indo-Pakistani Wars. Some were still in service in the 1990s. The basic design was that sound, that adaptable. The Panther and Tiger. Production ceased with Germany's defeat, and surviving tanks became museum pieces or range targets. The designs were dead ends. Too complex, too expensive, too specialized for post-war armies to adopt. the story of the Sherman isn't really about whether it was a good or bad tank. In isolated technical terms, it had real disadvantages against German heavy tanks. But that question misses the point entirely. The Sherman was the right tank for the war America needed to fight. It could be produced in massive numbers using America's existing industrial base. It could be shipped across oceans and landed on hostile beaches. It could be maintained by soldiers with reasonable training. It could be adapted for multiple roles. And critically, it could be integrated into a combined arms system that made the individual technical specifications of the tank almost irrelevant. German tank crews' mockery of the Sherman reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. They thought wars were won by having the best weapons. In reality, wars are won by having good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities, supported by superior logistics, backed by industrial capacity the enemy can't match, and integrated into a military system that maximizes their effectiveness. The Germans learned this lesson far too late and at terrible cost. Their technical superiority in tank design became meaningless when they couldn't fuel the tanks, couldn't replace them when lost, couldn't move them without being attacked from the air, and couldn't coordinate them with artillery and air support the way the Allies could. The Sherman's greatest strength wasn't its gun or its armor. It was that there were 50,000 of them, they worked when you needed them to work, and they were part of a military machine that the Germans simply couldn't overcome. When a German tank commander saw a Sherman in 1944, what he should have feared wasn't that individual tank. What he should have feared was what that Sherman represented: an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity, total air superiority, overwhelming artillery, efficient logistics, and the ability to replace any losses within days. The Sherman wasn't a tin can, it was the delivery system for American military power, and that power was unstoppable. German Panzer crews started the war laughing at the Sherman. They ended it broken by it, not because the Sherman was the better tank in isolation, but because it was part of a better system, and in warfare, systems beat machines every single time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into World War II armored warfare and the real story behind the Sherman tank, let me know in the comments what other misunderstood weapons or battles you'd like me to cover. Hit that subscribe button if you learned something new. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.